Gill.
Hey, welcome back in. This is the Steve Gill Show. Go to the website, GILLReport.com. Click on the Daily Notes button. You can find links to the stories we're talking about. Everybody anticipating the big speech tonight by President Barack Obama as he lays out his jobs plan. We'll be paying a lot of attention, talking a lot more about that tomorrow. Today, we're talking with Vice President Dick Cheney, former Vice President. His new book, In My Time, a personal and political memoir written with his daughter, Liz Cheney, who's been a guest on this show numerous times in the past. Mr. Vice President, Don Rumsfeld's book really kind of gave us a personal portrait of him. And so often in politics, and I think it was true with him, it's true of you, a lot of people have these caricatures of who they think you guys are. And I think both in his book and in yours, that personal story, it's amazing for a guy that's been in politics as long as you and he, that most people really don't know much about who you are. And yet you lay out a lot that tells us a lot of who you are, that you're not just this sort of public figure. You're a father, you're a husband, you're a son. I mean, there's a lot more to it.
Yeah, I think that's true. I always enjoy that part of biographies when I find a good one. I tried to match that with that first chapter we call, well, it's after the prologue, which is about 9/11, but we call the early years. And part of the fun of the book was going back and pulling together all those strains in terms of where my family came from and how we got to Nebraska and the early days that I could recall from when Dad was in the Navy in World War II, and we were living in the little town of Sumner, Nebraska with 296 folks with my grandparents. So it's fun to dig back into that stuff. And I think some people enjoy finding out about public figures, some of that background information.
And I don't think it is any shame on you, but you also talk about how you definitely outkicked your coverage in finding and securing Lynn Cheney, which we're all very proud of you and her for that as
right.
well. In the book, you started off right with the 9/11 day when they literally grabbed you and thrust you the decision-making, as you talk about it, the fog of war, when there were talk of planes being shot down and planes going down left and right. There are still folks today, as we approach this 9/11 10th anniversary, that say, oh, it didn't happen. There wasn't a plane that went into the Pentagon. They're not going to let the facts dissuade them. I mean, they almost have the impression that Dick Cheney was running around laying bombs in the towers and blowing them up. How do you feel about those kinds of attitudes 10 years later still persisting?
Well, I really don't pay any attention to them, Steve. Nothing you can do about people like that. There are just folks in the world who don't want to believe in certain things, and they go out of their way to try to find some way to explain it, that the government did it, or to deny that it ever happened. And I'd say I don't lose a lot of sleep over that. They're too dumb to check the historical record, or unwilling to rely on the facts. That's their problem.
Or even the admissions of guys like Khaled Sheikh Mohammed. I mean, they're saying they did it, so I mean, it's kind of hard to deny that. As you look
right.
back 10 years ago, I mean, it was a flashpoint that dramatically changed where the administration was headed. I mean, everything you thought was going to be your first or second term in office, man, it headed in a completely different direction.
Right. No, there's no question. I think when the president decided to run for president, he assumed he'd be involved in a lot of work on tax policy and on education, prescription drug benefits, and so forth. Of course, what 9/11 did was force us to spend a lot of time and effort and resources on preventing that next attack against the United States. Fortunately, we were successful, but it became the major agenda item, if you will, for our administration.
And as you point out in detail in the book, this was not something, whether it was going into Afghanistan, going into Iraq, these were not decisions that were made cavalierly with sort of a Cliff Notes version. These were the product of a lot of discussion and a lot of putting pieces together in the intelligence arena that leaves gaps. That's just the nature of the business.
Right. No, that's exactly the way it works. And we were fortunate. We had some great people working with us, especially our career military and intelligence personnel. And they did great work for us at crucial moments as we went forward.
One of the segments in the book that I think is particularly attuned to when we're having the head of a major labor union talk about, the SOBs and the Tea Party. We're hearing members of the Congressional Black Caucus talk about lynchings and everything. A lot of people are saying the tone and tenor in politics has gotten so much worse in recent years. Maybe it has from the left's perspective. I love the way you phrase it in the book, that you used a colorful epithet directed at Patrick Leahy when he was questioning your honor and your integrity. Is the tone and tenor in politics, you've been in this 40 years, Is it different, or is it just cable television now records every snippet? Every cell phone records every snippet of what happens, and we see more.
Well, I think you're right there that there are a lot of ways in which that information gets captured now that didn't used to exist. But I can remember the summer of 1968 when I first went down to Washington to rent an apartment to live in when we came down, Lynn and I, and our daughter arrived in September of that year. And this was the year we'd had everything from the Tet Offensive to the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, and riots in the cities. There had been some 14,000 federal troops sent into Washington to restore order. It was a very difficult time in our history. So when we look back at those years, sometimes there's a temptation to say, well, everything was smooth and everybody got along. And there wasn't a lot of conflict. And yet if you go back and you really take a look at the history of that period as well as many others, in fact, it was a time when there was a lot of strife and turmoil and ferment, if you will, in our political system. And everything wasn't sweetness and light.
The book is In My Time. Vice President Dick Cheney with us. As we look at the president speaking tonight, talking about his new jobs plan, the economy is in a shambles. It's interesting. They keep wanting to point the finger, blame back at you guys when gas prices were lower, when unemployment was lower, when we still had a AAA bond rating. As you look to the president's comments in his, quote, new jobs plan, I think it's the 7th or 8th, what do you anticipate hearing, and do you expect it to be anything different than we've already heard?
Well, I haven't seen it yet. I guess he's going to announce it tomorrow night. I guess it's tomorrow night. I'm concerned because I really think the economy is in trouble. I think we've got millions of Americans out there out of work who badly need to be able to find a job. And I think we need to put in place economic policies that will make it easier for the private sector to create more jobs. There's a limit to what government can do by way of actually hiring people to work for the government. And what I think we need is pretty dramatic tax reform, move in the direction of a situation that allows companies to expand and grow and develop and create jobs, that removes the uncertainty that's hanging over the marketplace out there when people don't know whether or not their taxes are going to go up, and that we've got a big regulatory burden that's being imposed on everybody that adds significantly to the cost of doing business. I think we've got to go back and change a lot of that out, do the kind of thing we did in the early Reagan years when we put in place pro-growth policies at the federal level that encouraged our businesses to expand and create jobs.
We know what works because we've seen it work in the past. We know what doesn't work because we've seen it fail miserably in the last couple of years. You've been out on this book tour, touting your book, visiting with a lot of folks. To me, one of the highlights of it was when you pulled out your heart monitor battery and freaked Sean Hannity out the other day. What's been the high, besides maybe that, what's been the high point on the book tour?
Well, the book tour has been a lot of fun to do. We've be headed back to Washington tomorrow, but then be back out on the road again on Monday. And so a good part of September we'll be out visiting various places around the country. Tonight I'm going to appear at the Nixon Library here in California, and so I've enjoyed it. You really get a chance to see a lot of people. Some of them old friends, some of them new ones, but there are a lot of people out there who are vitally and deeply and legitimately interested in some of the issues I write about in the book, and it's fun to have a chance to exchange views with all of them and see what they've got to suggest as well.
In My Time, the book, and in your time, what are you most proud of?
Well, I think about it from a policy standpoint, especially over the last 8 years. What I feel best about is the fact that we were able to prevent any further mass casualty attacks against the United States after 9/11. We were able to put in place policies that allowed us to block all further major terrorist attacks, and I think that was very important to do. I think we saved thousands of lives, and I think the president deserves a lot of credit for how that was handled.
People forget that in those days and weeks and months following, the anticipation was that there would be follow-on attacks, and as you point out, we dodged those bullets thanks to a lot of good folks in the military and our intelligence services and leaders like you, Mr. Vice President. Thank you so much for being with us. The book is In My Time. by Vice President Dick Cheney and his daughter Liz. I strongly recommend it, and we'll be back with more of the Steve Gill Show in just a moment.